Andrew Collins had not planned to spend his retirement years in a marina, yet life has a way of stripping away illusions of control and guiding you to places you would never have considered home. After his divorce, which left him with little more than his pension and a modest settlement, he sold the suburban house where his marriage had slowly withered and used the proceeds to buy into a small coastal harbor in a town that, to him, had always seemed like a stopgap place where people drifted in and out, never truly belonging. The marina was not glamorous. It was not filled with glossy yachts owned by weekend visitors from the city, but instead with a mismatched collection of fishing boats, worn motor cruisers, and sailboats that bore the weight of decades of salt air. He bought his share quietly, never announcing that he had acquired a portion of the property management rights, because he had no appetite for attention, and because he preferred to observe rather than to declare. To everyone else, he was simply another aging man with a boat, a solitary figure who sketched in a weathered notebook during the evenings, his head bent over lines of graphite while gulls cried overhead. In truth, his boat had become his refuge, a floating workshop where he scribbled design ideas for piers and waterfront houses he would never actually build, a place where his memories of architecture lived without being demanded for profit. The other tenants at the marina, who rented their slips from the association, quickly categorized him in their unspoken hierarchy. He was the quiet type, not unfriendly but not social, the sort who would nod when spoken to but never linger for small talk. They tolerated his presence but did not include him in barbecues or late-night gatherings on the dock. This suited him perfectly. After years of being scrutinized, argued with, and worn down by the demands of clients and an ex-wife who had considered his silence a form of cruelty, Andrew relished being invisible. Yet, he was never careless about the marina itself. He noticed when planks on the dock warped from rain, when the wiring in the storage shed was frayed, when the water lines hissed from pressure imbalances. These things he repaired quietly, anonymously, with the efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding structures and their failures. Among the tenants there was one voice that carried louder than the others, and that belonged to Karen Miller. She had occupied her slip for nearly 15 years. Her boat, a once grand motor cruiser, kept afloat more by sheer obstinacy than by maintenance. Karen styled herself as the unofficial guardian of the docks, a role no one had bestowed upon her but which she clung to with the certainty of a hereditary title. She interfered in disputes between other boaters, dictated where people should park their cars, and carried herself with the hauteur of a woman who believed longevity equaled authority. Most renters humored her, rolling their eyes in private but rarely confronting her directly, because it was easier to let her believe she was in charge than to endure the storm of complaints she unleashed on anyone who contradicted her. Andrew, however, was not impressed by her performance. He listened to her pronouncements the way one listens to a seagull's cries, loud, persistent, and ultimately meaningless. For months their interaction was limited to perfunctory greetings, though he noticed her eyes lingered on his boat with something more than curiosity. It was as though she regarded it as an intruder, a vessel that disrupted the unspoken order she presided over. He suspected she resented the fact that he had secured a slip adjacent to hers, giving her less space to maneuver, but she had not voiced this directly. Instead, she favored passive remarks in earshot of others, comments about newcomers who didn't understand how things worked around here, or about people who thought the marina was theirs just because they paid rent. What Karen could not have known was that Andrew's stake in the marina went far beyond rent. Months earlier, when the aging owner of the dock sought to retire, Andrew had quietly bought into the controlling partnership, allowing him oversight of operations and authority over leases. He chose not to reveal this, partly out of reluctance to provoke resentment, and partly because anonymity afforded him the luxury of observing the social mechanics without interference. He knew that tenants, if aware, would immediately see him not as a fellow boat owner but as management, and they would adjust their behavior accordingly. Remaining invisible gave him a clearer picture of the truth. This hidden role was not motivated by ambition. Andrew had no grand designs to reshape the marina, no fantasies of wielding power. For him, the investment was practical, a way to ensure he had a secure place for his boat, a modest source of income, and perhaps a final project where he could apply his eye for design without the suffocating oversight of committees and city councils. He imagined repairing the docks, introducing subtle improvements, maybe even sketching a pavilion for gatherings if the tenants ever proved capable of civil coexistence. He never imagined the harbor as a battleground. But then again, he had not yet learned the full force of Karen Miller's conviction that the marina was hers and hers alone. The first clash between Andrew and Karen was not loud or spectacular, but rather one of those small encounters that lodge themselves under the skin and continue to irritate long after the words are spoken, a passing remark that carried enough venom to signal what lay beneath the surface. It happened on a late afternoon when the tide was low and the boats along the dock shifted lazily in their slips, ropes creaking against the wooden pilings. Andrew had returned from a short sail and was securing his lines when Karen appeared, dressed in her usual bright floral blouse that clashed with the salt-stained deck of her cruiser. She carried a clipboard, though no one had ever asked her to perform inspections, and she stopped directly beside him, her shadow cutting across the deck. With a practiced sigh, she announced that he had tied his boat too close to hers, that her vessel needed space to swing during storms, and that his placement was inconsiderate. Andrew, who had measured the lines precisely, answered politely that his boat was secured within the dimensions of his lease and posed no threat to hers. The conversation could have ended there, but Karen leaned closer, her voice carrying to nearby tenants, and remarked that newcomers should learn their place before they start crowding out the people who built this community. Andrew did not reply. He merely tightened his knot, but inside he recognized the warning. She had marked him as an adversary. In the following days, Karen's discontent grew more visible. She spoke louder during gatherings, dropping pointed comments about strangers who acted as if they owned the docks. An irony Andrew noted silently. She began leaving items, fenders, buckets, tangled ropes, spilling onto the walkway near his slip, small obstacles that forced him to step around. Once he found his power cord unplugged, though no one admitted to touching it. These were petty hostilities, the kind that accumulate and erode patience, but Andrew endured them without complaint. He had lived through divorce court, through architectural projects that collapsed under litigation, through years of watching his reputation questioned by people who barely understood his work. One woman with a loud voice could not frighten him. Yet Karen was not content with minor victories. One evening, after a storm had rolled through, Andrew returned to find his boat sitting lower in the water than usual. At first he assumed the rain had filled the bilge, but as he stepped aboard, the deck listed strangely, and when he opened the hatch his breath caught in his chest. Water poured in through a clean horizontal gash cut directly along the hull just above the waterline, a surgical wound that had sliced his boat nearly in half. It was not the jagged tear of an accident, not damage from floating debris or collision, but the work of deliberate tools, an electric saw, or perhaps an industrial cutter. The cut ran with chilling precision, as though someone had measured the line and executed it without hesitation. His boat, his refuge, the vessel that carried not only his sketches and tools but also his sense of stability, had been gutted. For several minutes he simply stood there, the sound of water gurgling into the bilge filling the silence, his hands gripping the hatch frame until his knuckles whitened. Rage did not come immediately. Instead, there was disbelief, the hollow shock of realizing that someone had crossed an invisible line. Boats were more than property. Among sailors, they were extensions of identity, fragile homes floating on unpredictable water. To destroy a man's boat was to declare war on his very existence. He began bailing instinctively, though he knew the damage was beyond repair. The marina workers, alerted by his movements, rushed to help, and together they managed to stabilize the vessel with pumps until it could be hauled on to the slipway. But the cut was plain for all to see. and whispers traveled quickly along the dock. That night, Andrew sat in the dim cabin, the pump thudding rhythmically, and tried to make sense of what had happened. He replayed Karen's remarks, her disdain, her certainty that newcomers must defer to her. He remembered the smirk when she spoke about space, about respect, about who belonged. And then he recalled her voice drifting across the dock during a weekend gathering, raised just enough for others to hear. Some people think they can just drop in here with their fancy boats. Maybe the sea will teach them a lesson. At the time, it had sounded like bluster, but now it rang with sinister implication. The following morning, he confronted the Marina office, demanding to know if any cameras overlooked the slips, but of course the system was outdated, positioned only toward the parking lot and the entrance gate. No footage existed of the dock itself. The workers shook their heads, muttered about vandalism, but offered no solutions. Andrew considered calling the police, yet he hesitated. He imagined the questions, the bureaucracy, the likelihood that the case would be dismissed as unprovable vandalism. What could he show them? A boat sliced open in the night, a neighbor with a reputation for bluster, and no witnesses. It would be his word against hers. And Karen, with her network of allies and her shameless certainty, would spin the story until he appeared paranoid. Later that day, as if to confirm his suspicion, Karen stood on the dock with a cup of coffee, laughing with two other tenants. When Andrew passed, she turned and said loudly, "It's such a shame when boats just give out like that. Guess some people don't know how to maintain their vessels." The laughter that followed was brittle, forced, but it cut deeper than the saw. She was daring him to accuse her, daring him to reveal anger because she knew anger would make him look unstable. Andrew said nothing, but the decision crystallized inside him. If Karen thought she had eliminated a rival tenant, she was mistaken. She had made the error of attacking a man who was not merely a renter, but the owner of the very ground beneath her boat. And, though he did not yet know how, Andrew understood that he would answer this attack not with shouts, but with precision equal to the blade that had gutted his vessel. The catalyst was complete. His world had shifted from quiet retreat to battlefield, and the war had been declared not by him, but by the woman who believed the Marina was hers alone. Andrew did not rush into retaliation, for his instincts told him that reacting with noise or accusation would only play into Karen's hands, and instead he allowed a few days to pass during which he continued his quiet presence at the Marina, repairing what he could of his ruined vessel while listening carefully to the currents of conversation that flowed among the tenants. Rumors spread quickly in a community bound together by ropes and moorings, and soon he noticed that Karen was shaping the story to suit her own narrative, describing the damage to his boat as an unfortunate structural failure, a weakness in the hull, that any experienced sailor could have predicted. And she delivered these remarks with the air of an expert, head tilted, hands gesturing broadly, while those around her nodded uneasily, aware of her reputation for exaggeration, but reluctant to confront her. Andrew absorbed these conversations in silence, but beneath that silence he was plotting. He had learned long ago in the exhausting world of architecture where egos clashed over budgets and blueprints that power rarely depended on who shouted loudest, but rather on who controlled the paper, who kept the records, who had the authority to stamp a document that others depended on. Karen might control the social theater of the dock, but he controlled the leases, the fees, the administrative heartbeat of the Marina. For months he had refrained from exercising this authority, preferring to remain a shadow, but now her assault had forced his hand. The first step was subtle. A notice of adjustment to her rental agreement, printed on formal letterhead and slipped discreetly into her mailbox. The letter stated, without emotion, that due to recent revisions in operating costs, her slip's rental fee would increase significantly at the start of the next quarter. No explanation, no apology, just the bureaucratic language of necessity. Karen's reaction was swift and theatrical. She stormed into the Marina office waving the letter, her voice echoing through the small lobby as she accused the staff of incompetence, corruption, and harassment. The young clerk, who knew nothing of the ownership structure, could only repeat that the notice had come from the owner and that any complaints should be directed accordingly. Karen demanded to know who the new owner was, but the clerk, instructed by Andrew in advance, simply shrugged and told her the information was confidential. To Karen, used to bullying her way into obedience, this wall of quiet resistance was infuriating. She left muttering about conspiracies, about strangers taking over what she believed was her territory. Meanwhile, Andrew watched from a distance, never revealing his presence in the office, and when Karen passed him later on the dock, she offered a glare that could have cut through steel. He met it calmly, his face unreadable, and returned to the task of sanding the broken edges of his boat's hull. That was the first moment she seemed to sense, though she could not yet approve, that he might be more than the solitary tenant she had dismissed. Her hostility deepened. In the days that followed, Karen escalated her campaign of pressure. Items from Andrew's dock box disappeared. His lines were mysteriously loosened so that his boat knocked against the pilings, and twice he found shards of glass near his tires in the parking lot. These were the tactics of intimidation, and though Andrew documented each incident in his notebook, he refrained from open complaint. Instead, he focused on gathering information. Through the Marina's accountant, he reviewed Karen's payment history and discovered a pattern of late fees and disputed charges that painted a portrait of long-term irresponsibility. She had always managed to talk her way out of penalties, relying on charm or intimidation, but now those records would serve as ammunition should the conflict grow more formal. The true escalation arrived during a Saturday afternoon when most tenants were present. Karen approached Andrew at his slip, her voice loud enough for the entire dock to hear, accusing him directly of endangering her vessel by tying his boat too close and claiming that she had witnesses to prove his negligence. The crowd, drawn by the sound, gathered in uneasy semicircles, watching with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Andrew straightened slowly, wiped his hands on a rag, and answered not with denial, but with a simple, deliberate statement. "My boat is tied, according to the lease I signed. If you believe otherwise, you should take it up with the owner." The words were delivered evenly, without flourish, but they landed with the force of revelation. For the suggestion that there was a higher authority than Karen unsettled those who had grown accustomed to her dominance. She faltered for the briefest moment, then recovered with a sneer, insisting that she knew the owner personally, that she had more influence than any newcomer ever would. Andrew let the silence stretch before replying, "Perhaps you should ask him directly." He left the statement hanging and returned to his work, but in that instant the balance of power shifted subtly. Those watching realized that Andrew was not intimidated, that he might in fact hold knowledge Karen did not, and though no one said so aloud, the whispers began. By refusing to engage in her drama, by hinting at a deeper authority, he had planted doubt in the minds of her audience, and Karen, sensing the erosion of her control, grew increasingly desperate. That evening she was seen pacing along the dock, muttering into her phone, her gestures sharp and frantic. Andrew observed from his cabin, the glow of his lamp illuminating the pages of his notebook where he was drafting not designs for buildings, but a meticulous chronology of every incident since his arrival. He understood that escalation was inevitable, that Karen would not retreat quietly, and so he prepared himself with the patience of a man who had fought long wars of attrition in boardrooms and city councils. The Marina had become his battleground, and though he had not chosen the fight, he would ensure that the next move was his. The atmosphere of the Marina shifted almost imperceptibly after Andrew's quiet assertion in front of the other tenants. But it was enough to change the fragile equilibrium that had allowed Karen to dominate for so many years. Where once her words were met with nods or silence, now they drew sideways glances, muttered questions, and moments of hesitation. It was not yet rebellion, but it was doubt, and doubt is a dangerous seed when a person's authority rests entirely on perception. Andrew, for his part, did nothing to fan the flames directly. He continued to occupy his boat, methodically repairing what could be salvaged from the damage and planning the eventual replacement of sections too badly ruined. But he knew that Karen was unraveling behind the facade of confidence she projected. He could sense it in the clipped edge of her laughter, in the way her conversations turned abruptly to grievances, in the frequency with which she paraded down the dock as if patrolling territory that she feared was slipping from her grasp. The midpoint came when she decided to consolidate her power through spectacle, calling for what she described as a community meeting to be held on a Sunday afternoon when most tenants would be present. She positioned herself as the host, circulating notices written in her careful script and pinned to the communal boards, declaring that important matters concerning rental fees and maintenance would be addressed. Andrew received his notice like the others, folded and slipped into the handle of his dock box, and he read it with a wry smile because he knew that Karen had no authority to convene such a meeting. Yet she believed in the strength of appearances. He decided he would attend, not because he wished to confront her publicly, but because sometimes the best way to dismantle a tyrant is to let them speak long enough to expose their weakness. The day of the gathering was hot, the air heavy with the smell of salt and diesel, and the tenants assembled reluctantly, shading their eyes against the glare of the water. Karen stood at the center of the dock with a clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield, her bright dress fluttering in the wind, and she began with a speech about tradition, about how long she had been a steward of the Marina, about how the place had thrived under her informal watch. She complained of recent changes, particularly the new rental notices, and described them as unfair, imposed without consultation, evidence of an unseen hand trying to undermine the fabric of their community. She spoke with passion, her words tumbling over each other, and she gestured toward Andrew more than once, though never naming him outright, suggesting that some people were behind these injustices, people who had no respect for history. Andrew listened calmly, his arms folded, his gaze steady. When Karen invited the others to sign a petition she had drafted demanding that the rental increases be reversed, several stepped forward, not out of conviction, but out of habit, the old instinct to placate her. Yet there was hesitation and murmurs of uncertainty. At that moment, Andrew stepped forward. His voice was not raised, but the clarity of it cut through the restless murmur. He said that he had been silent until now because he had wanted to understand the character of the Marina before making changes, but that it was time for the truth to be known. He revealed without flourish that he was not merely a tenant, but one of the legal owners of the property, that the adjustments to the fees had been authorized by him in line with maintenance costs, and that he intended to bring transparency and fairness to the management. The dock fell silent, the tenants staring at him in stunned disbelief, and then their gazes shifted toward Karen, who had turned pale beneath her painted smile. Karen tried to recover, insisting that his claim was absurd, that she had known the previous owner for years and would never have been left uninformed about such a sale. But Andrew, anticipating this, produced the official deed of transfer, a crisp document bearing the signatures and seals that could not be disputed. He held it out calmly, and those nearest leaned to see. The silence deepened into something heavier than mere shock. It was recognition, the realization that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably, that the woman who had strutted as their protector was, in truth, powerless. For the first time, Karen faltered visibly, her words stumbling, her gestures sharp and defensive. She accused Andrew of manipulation, of fabricating documents, of plotting against her. But the more she protested, the more desperate she appeared. The tenants did not rush to embrace Andrew as their savior, but they recoiled from Karen's unraveling performance, and that recoil was enough. Authority once lost cannot be reclaimed by volume. She ended the meeting abruptly, shoving her petition into her bag and storming away down the dock, leaving behind a crowd that dispersed in uneasy silence. That night, Andrew remained awake long after the Marina quieted, sitting on the deck of his wounded boat and listening to the water slap gently against the pilings. He felt no triumph, only the weight of inevitability. He knew Karen would not surrender. Her pride was too deep, her need for control too consuming. By exposing himself, by declaring his role, he had forced her hand, and she would now strike with whatever weapons remained. He imagined her pacing in her cabin, calling friends, concocting schemes. He imagined her staring at the slip beside her, the reminder of the man who had quietly watched and then revealed himself as the master of the ground she stood on. She would not forgive that humiliation, and he was right. Within days, Karen began circulating new rumors, whispering that Andrew was not who he claimed to be, that he had forged his documents, that he was a manipulator preying on an elderly owner who had been too weak to resist. She hinted darkly that she would bring the truth to light, and that soon everyone would see what kind of man he was. Andrew, though outwardly calm, recognized the danger in these insinuations, for lies are like oil spilled on water. They spread quickly, staining everything they touch, and often people prefer the simplicity of suspicion to the complexity of truth. He resolved to gather evidence meticulously, to prepare for the inevitable confrontation where words alone would not suffice. The midpoint had been reached. The battle was no longer hidden in whispers or shadows, but stood in the open. A clash not merely of property rights, but of pride, of identity, of who controlled the fragile world of the Marina. Andrew had revealed himself, Karen had been unmasked, and the war between them would only grow harsher from here. The days following the failed meeting brought no peace, for if Karen had been shaken by Andrew's revelation, she now seemed determined to rebuild her crumbling authority by any means available, and her tactics shifted from loud public speeches to quieter, more insidious maneuvers that tested the patience of everyone around her. Andrew noticed almost immediately that the air at the marina had thickened with suspicion. Conversations hushed when he approached, and though some tenants offered him curt nods, most avoided eye contact as if fearing that to acknowledge him was to take a side in a battle they would rather pretend did not exist. It was Karen's doing, of course, for she had begun whispering in corners and making calls to anyone who would listen, telling a story in which Andrew was not an owner at all but an interloper who had manipulated paperwork to steal what was never his. She carried around a manila folder filled with what she claimed were her own records. Old receipts, a copy of a long-expired lease agreement, even a photograph of herself at the dock decades earlier, as though the accumulation of relics could outweigh the solidity of legal documents. Andrew, aware that truth is rarely sufficient against rumor, resisted the urge to challenge her directly, instead maintaining his calm and continuing to repair his boat with the meticulous patience of a craftsman. Yet the provocations escalated. One evening he discovered his dock box pried open, its contents scattered into the water, and though he could not prove Karen's involvement, the smirk she offered the following morning was evidence enough. On another occasion, a neighbor who had once been friendly informed him apologetically that Karen had visited their cabin with warnings that Andrew intended to evict long-standing tenants, an outright fabrication designed to stir resentment. He recognized the strategy. If she could not discredit him outright, she would poison his relationships until he stood isolated, easy to target. What she underestimated, however, was Andrew's capacity for endurance. Years in architecture had taught him that projects survived not by brute force but by resilience against endless obstacles, budget cuts, zoning laws, angry committees. He understood that battles were not won by immediate strikes but by steady accumulation of pressure until the opposition collapsed under its own contradictions. Thus, rather than shouting down her accusations, he began quietly gathering evidence. He requested copies of financial records from the previous owner, documents that revealed Karen's long history of late payments, her repeated disputes over minor fees, her tendency to claim exceptions whenever convenient. He even located a series of written complaints from other tenants about her behavior, filed over the years but ignored because no one had been willing to enforce consequences. These papers formed a dossier, not for immediate attack but for the inevitable confrontation he knew would come. Karen, meanwhile, sensing that rumors alone might not suffice, attempted a more brazen tactic. She appeared at the Marina office one morning brandishing what she described as a grandfathered lease, a photocopied document that supposedly guaranteed her slip at a fixed rate for life. She waved it at the bewildered clerk, insisting that the recent rent increase was therefore illegal. When word of this reached Andrew, he examined the document with the cool detachment of a professional and immediately recognized it as a forgery. The formatting was inconsistent, the notary seal a crude imitation, and the signatures clearly traced. Yet Karen presented it to her neighbors with triumph, declaring that she had proof of Andrew's deception. Some believed her, or at least pretended to, but others, more cautious, noticed the flaws and withheld judgment. The decisive moment of escalation occurred late one evening when Andrew returned from town to find Karen standing on the dock with a cluster of tenants, her voice raised in dramatic outrage. She was accusing him of harassment, claiming that he had threatened her in private and that she feared for her safety. The accusation was absurd, yet it carried weight in the charged atmosphere she had cultivated, and several tenants looked at him with uncertainty as he approached. Andrew did not respond with denial. Instead, he calmly produced a folder containing the documents he had gathered, her payment records, the old complaints, the obvious forgeries. He laid them out on the dock box under the glow of a lantern, inviting anyone present to examine them. There was a long silence as pages passed from hand to hand, eyes widening, murmurs spreading. Karen tried to snatch the papers away, declaring them lies, but the evidence was undeniable. It was then that her voice cracked, shrill with desperation, as she shouted that Andrew was destroying the Marina, that he was an outsider who would never belong, that everyone would regret siding with him. But her words no longer carried the same weight, and as she realized it, her fury curdled into something darker. She leaned close to Andrew, her voice low but audible enough for those near to hear, and hissed that she would rather see the entire Marina rot than allow him to take it from her. It was not a threat in the theatrical sense, but a confession of intent, and in that moment the tenants who had tolerated her tyranny began to see the truth. Andrew, though outwardly calm, felt the gravity of her words settle over him like a shadow. He understood that Karen had crossed a boundary beyond ordinary spite. She was prepared to sabotage not only him but the entire community to preserve her illusion of power. The escalation was complete. The conflict was no longer about rent or slips but about survival, about whether reason and order could withstand the corrosive force of one woman's pride. He returned to his cabin that night knowing the storm had only just begun. The breaking point arrived on a gray afternoon when the tide ran high and the sky sagged with clouds swollen but not yet spilling rain, the kind of weather that cast a weight over the harbor and made every sound carry farther across the water. Andrew had spent the morning cataloging receipts in his cabin, preparing for the next inevitable confrontation, when a knock rattled against his hull. One of the younger tenants stood there, hesitant, shifting from foot to foot before admitting that Karen had summoned another meeting, this time not on the dock but in the community hall overlooking the Marina. It was framed as an emergency, an attempt to address what she called the fraudulent claims of ownership that threaten our way of life. Andrew knew instantly that this was the moment she had been working toward, the final gamble where she would either reclaim her dominance or collapse beneath the weight of her lies. He thanked the young man, closed his ledger, and walked up the dock with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this confrontation in his mind 1,000 times. The hall was nearly full when he arrived, the tenants clustered on folding chairs, murmuring among themselves while Karen stood at the front, her hair lacquered into rigid curls, her voice sharp with theatrical outrage. She held up the same forged lease she had been waving for weeks, proclaiming that Andrew's claim to ownership was fabricated, that she had uncovered evidence of manipulation, that she was the victim of a conspiracy designed to drive her from the place she had nurtured for decades. Her words rose and fell like waves, sweeping the room into unease, and though some looked unconvinced, others shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to dismiss her entirely. Karen's talent had always been in creating just enough doubt to paralyze those around her, and she wielded it now with the desperation of a gambler laying her last card on the table. When Andrew stepped forward, the room quieted, for his silence until that moment had been its own form of power, and now all waited to see how he would respond. He carried no notes, no folder, only a single envelope which he laid gently on the table before him. He began not with accusations, but with a patient explanation of the sale process, describing how he had purchased his share from the previous owner, how the transaction had been recorded with the county, how every document bore the appropriate seals and signatures. He spoke not as a man defending himself, but as one clarifying a misunderstanding, his tone even and steady. Then he opened the envelope and drew out certified copies of the deed transfer, notarized and stamped by the county clerk. He passed them to the front row, inviting inspection, and one by one the tenants leaned over the pages, tracing the embossed seals with their fingers, nodding reluctantly as the truth settled in. Karen lunged forward, attempting to snatch the papers, shouting that they were forged, that Andrew had bribed officials, that nothing could be trusted. Her voice rose to a shriek, echoing in the small hall, and the tenants recoiled from the spectacle. Andrew did not raise his voice. He simply reached into his pocket and produced one final piece of evidence. A letter from the county recorder verifying the legitimacy of the documents and the transfer of ownership. He held it up long enough for all to see before placing it calmly on the table. The contrast between his composure and Karen's unraveling fury was devastating. The silence that followed was thicker than any storm. Karen's face twisted as she realized that the audience she had always commanded was slipping away, that no amount of bluster could erase the clarity of stamped paper. In that silence, she made her last mistake. She shouted that she had cut Andrew's boat herself, that she had done it to protect the Marina from outsiders, and that she would do it again if necessary. The confession, ripped from her by anger, hung in the air like smoke. Gasps erupted from the crowd, and for the first time there was no doubt, no hesitation, only the collective recognition that she had exposed herself completely. Andrew did not need to answer. The tenants turned from her of their own accord, their expressions hardening with a mixture of shock and disgust. One of them stood and declared that she should be removed from the docks immediately, and murmurs of agreement rippled through the hall. Karen froze, her bravado collapsing into a brittle silence, and then, without another word, she stormed from the room, the slam of the door reverberating like the closing of a chapter. Andrew remained where he was, gathering the papers slowly, his movements deliberate, for he understood that victory was not measured in cheers or applause, but in the absence of resistance. The battle had reached its climax not with a fight, but with the exposure of truth, and the woman who had sought to rule through intimidation and deceit had undone herself with her own fury. The Marina, at last, was his to govern not through dominance but through the quiet authority of legitimacy, and as he walked back to his slip beneath the heavy sky, he felt the first fragile stirrings of peace. The aftermath of the confrontation unfolded quietly, without the dramatic scenes Karen had always thrived upon, and that was perhaps the greatest punishment of all, for instead of fiery arguments and defiant speeches there was only silence. The steady erasure of her presence from a community that had once tolerated her dominance. Within a week, her boat was towed away under order of the Marina office after she failed to pay overdue fees. Her belongings left hastily packed into the back of a rusting SUV that disappeared down the coastal road one early morning without farewell. No one came to wave her off. No one shouted encouragement or sympathy, and for the first time in years the docks seemed to exhale, free of the weight of her constant surveillance and complaint. Andrew observed the departure from the deck of his repaired boat, not with gloating, but with the sober recognition that what had ended was not simply her tenancy, but an era of intimidation that had warped the spirit of the place. The tenants, cautious at first, began to approach him with questions and small gestures of goodwill, tentative acknowledgments that they now understood who he was and what role he played. Some offered apologies for having believed Karen's stories, others simply nodded in quiet solidarity, and Andrew accepted each response with patience, neither demanding allegiance nor resenting their earlier hesitation. He set about organizing necessary repairs, replacing warped planks, updating safety equipment, ensuring that the marina could be maintained with the dignity it deserved, and gradually a sense of order replaced the chaos Karen had cultivated. The docks grew calmer, not silent but balanced, as laughter and conversation returned without the sharp edge of fear that had once colored every exchange. For Andrew, the resolution did not bring triumph, but rather a deeper sense of belonging than he had expected when he first arrived as a man seeking refuge after the collapse of his marriage and career. The marina became more than a shelter for his boat. It became a place where his patience, his endurance, and his quiet insistence on truth had reshaped the small society around him. Karen's absence was not celebrated but accepted as necessary, and in that acceptance he found the peace he had thought impossible. The battle was over, not through victory declared but through calm restored, and in the rhythm of the tides against the pilings he heard something close to renewal.